Right. So today we're going to tackle like a huge question, like one of the big ones.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
why are some nations wealthy
Right.
and some nations poor?
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Like, it's this age-old puzzle, right?
Yeah, it's a classic one.
Yeah.
You're on forever.
And for this deep dive, we're going to be looking to Why Nations Fail
Yes.
by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson.
A fantastic book.
This book is like,
Hugely influential.
Bill Gates recommends it.
Yeah, a lot of people have said very good things about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But before we get into it,
Okay.
just off the top of your head,
Sure.
when you think about why some nations are wealthy and some are poor, what's like the first thing you think of?
The first thing I think of is geography.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah.
Some countries are just in places that are
Right.
easier to develop.
Better for agriculture.
Yeah, more resources like
yeah.
oil
Yeah.
or, arable land, things like that.
What about culture?
Culture.
Some cultures are more entrepreneurial.
Yeah. I mean,
It's hardworking.
that's definitely another popular one.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Acemoglu and Robinson
Yeah.
say all of that is wrong.
Yeah. Basically, that was sort of the conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
But these authors looked at it and they said,
For 15 years.
15 years of research.
Yeah.
Hundreds of different case studies, different countries.
Yeah.
And they say, it's not those things.
So what is it?
What it really comes down to, they say, is what they call institutional codes.
Institutional codes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's
the core.
kind of vague.
Yeah.
So what?
I'm very abstract at this point.
Yeah. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, so I think a good way to kind of illustrate what they're talking about is to look at a couple of their examples.
Okay.
And one of the most striking ones is North and South Korea.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Same people, same peninsula, same culture, essentially.
Culturally very similar.
Yeah, very, very similar.
Yeah.
But radically different economic outcomes.
Yeah. And we're talking about like a huge difference.
Oh, yeah.
What are we talking about here?
So in 1990, South Korea's per capita GDP was about 5 times higher than North Korea's.
Okay.
Which is already a pretty big gap.
Yeah, it's big.
But now it's more like 20 times.
20 times.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so clearly something else is going on.
Something beyond just like basic resources or...
Not the geography.
Yeah.
Not the culture.
Yeah.
So...
There's got to be something else.
Yeah, you got another example for me.
Yeah, so one that really drives it home is if you look at the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and specifically the city of Nogales, which is right on the border.
Right.
And it's actually split in half by the border.
So there's like a Nogales, U.S.
Nogales, Arizona.
And a Nogales, Mexico.
And Nogales, Sonora in Mexico.
Yep. They're right next to each other.
Right next to each other. And the difference in living standards is stark.
Like, what are we talking?
Like, people in Nogales, Arizona have much higher life expectancy.
Okay.
They have way higher incomes.
Okay.
So much better health outcomes.
Is there something magic about that border?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question the authors pose, right?
Yeah,
what is it about that line that makes such a difference?
Right. So obviously.
And the answer is, it's not the line.
It's these...
institutions.
Institutional codes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's break down these institutional codes.
Right.
What are we really talking about?
Yeah, so the authors talk about...
When we say that.
2 main types of institutions.
Okay.
Inclusive institutions. And extractive institutions.
Inclusive and extractive. Okay, so let's start with inclusive.
Right.
What does it mean?
So inclusive institutions.
For institution to be inclusive.
Are ones that allow broad participation in the economy.
Okay.
They have strong property rights.
Okay.
So people can...
So you're not going to have your stuff taken away from you.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
You have the right to what you own.
Right.
And the government's not going to come and seize it.
Okay. So that encourages investment.
It encourages investment, encourages innovation.
Right. If you know that you're going to reap the benefits.
Right. Yeah.
You're more likely to
take the risks. Take risks.
Yeah.
And the rule of law is important.
Okay, so that means
that means that the law applies to everybody.
Everyone is equal under the law.
Everybody's equal under the law.
Not just the elites.
Including the elites.
Okay.
So you can't just
buy
your way out of trouble.
Okay.
If you're powerful.
Got it. All right,
so these are
inclusive institutions sound pretty good.
These are institutions that create kind of like a fertile soil for economic growth.
So anyone?
Yeah, anyone can plant a seed and
can participate. And
it can grow.
Yeah, okay. All right, so that's inclusive.
So that's inclusive.
What about extractive?
All right, so extractive institutions are the opposite.
Okay.
These are institutions where a small elite controls power.
Okay.
And they use that power to extract resources from the rest of the population.
The rest of the population.
Yeah, so they set up the rules of the game
in a way that benefits them.
In a way that benefits them.
At the expense of?
At the expense of everybody else.
Everyone else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Got it.
It's like a pump.
A pump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's constantly sucking wealth up to the top.
To the elite.
To the elite.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so extractive institutions sound bad for the nation as a whole. They're not good for long-term growth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because they stifle innovation.
Yeah.
They prevent people from participating in the economy.
Can you give me a concrete example of how extractive institutions have led to a nation's failure?
A really good example is Argentina.
Okay.
In the 19th century.
Okay.
Argentina was actually one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
Really?
Yeah, they were like the 7th richest country.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Okay. And why were they so wealthy?
They were exporting a ton of beef to Europe.
To Europe.
Yeah. But the elite in Argentina.
The beef elite.
The beef elite, yeah.
Okay.
They were very powerful.
Okay.
And they were afraid of industrialization.
Oh, interesting.
They thought that if Argentina industrialized,
they would lose power.
They would lose their power.
Okay. So what did they do?
So they basically blocked it.
They blocked industrialization.
Yeah, they implemented policies that favored agriculture.
Okay.
And discouraged industry.
Wow, so they were putting their own...
They were protecting their own interests.
Yeah. Above those of the nation.
Exactly.
Okay.
What was the long-term result?
Well, the result was that Argentina fell behind.
Okay.
They didn't diversify their economy.
Okay.
And today, Argentina's per capita GDP is only about a third of what it is in the United States.
Wow.
Yeah.
From 7th richest in the world?
Yeah.
To
pretty dramatic decline.
A third of the U.S.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a pretty stark example of what can happen when you have extractive institutions that are allowed to persist.
Okay, now flip side.
Okay.
You got a success story for me.
Yeah.
A country that developed inclusive institutions.
All right.
And really reaped the benefits.
Yeah. A great example is Botswana.
Botswana.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when Botswana gained independence in 1966...
They were one of the poorest countries in the world.
Okay.
They had very little infrastructure.
Like how much?
Like 12 kilometers of paved road.
12 kilometers of paved road in the whole country?
The whole country.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Their per capita income was less than $100.
$100?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So
not a great starting point.
Not a great starting point.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
But they did a few things, right?
Okay.
So first of all, they discovered diamonds, which is,
that'll help.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
But instead of letting that wealth
be siphoned off
by a small elite,
right,
they channeled it into a national development fund.
Okay, so they used it.
They used it to invest in education.
Okay.
In infrastructure.
Okay.
In healthcare.
Right. So they really invested in the nation.
They invested in the nation as a whole.
As a whole, not just lining their own pockets.
Yeah. And they also established a very transparent government.
Okay. Botswana is actually considered one of the least corrupt countries in Africa.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they've had consistent democratic elections.
Okay. So really good governance.
Really good governance.
Yeah. And so what was the outcome of all this?
The outcome was that Botswana became a huge success story.
Okay.
Their economy grew rapidly.
Right.
And their per capita GDP now is actually 1.5 times higher than South Africa. Yeah. Which is, a much larger country with more resources.
More established economy.
Yeah.
And they're doing better.
They're doing better.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So Botswana shows that you can...
It's possible.
Even from a really...
To escape poverty.
Bad starting point.
Even from a very disadvantaged starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've talked about inclusive institutions, extractive institutions.
Right.
We've seen how they can lead to very different outcomes.
But how do these institutions form in the first place?
Yeah, how do they come about?
Like, where do they come from?
So one of the key concepts is what the authors call institutional drift.
Institutional drift.
Yeah.
Okay, what's that?
So it's kind of like...
Is that like mission drift?
It's similar.
Okay.
It's like plate tectonics.
Okay.
So you know how the Earth's crust is made up of these plates that are constantly moving very slowly?
Yeah.
And over millions of years,
yeah,
they can create mountains and valleys and oceans.
They can like rearrange the continents?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So institutional drift is kind of like that.
Okay.
It's this very slow, gradual process where institutions change over time.
Okay.
Often in response to...
In response to what?
To small events.
Small events.
Yeah. Or seemingly insignificant decisions.
Okay. So like, give me an example.
Okay. So a great example is the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688.
The Glorious Revolution?
Yeah.
Okay. What was so glorious about it?
Well, it wasn't like a super violent revolution. It was more like a
changing of the guard?
Yeah, a changing of the guard.
Okay.
But essentially what happened was that Parliament took power away from the king and established its own supremacy.
Okay.
And this...
So kind of a power shift.
Yeah, power shift.
Right.
And this had huge long-term consequences.
Okay. Like what?
Because it created a more secure environment for property rights.
Okay.
And it limited the power of the king
to
just arbitrarily seize people's wealth.
So this was good for the economy?
This was very good for the economy.
Okay.
And it laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution.
Really? Right. So how did that relatively small event lead to the Industrial Revolution?
Well, because now inventors and entrepreneurs could be more confident that if they came up with a new invention, they would actually benefit from it. They wouldn't have it taken away from them by the king.
Right. So they had more incentive to innovate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So there seemingly...
The Glorious Revolution was a key...
minor event actually had these...
Yeah, it seems like a small thing.
Huge ripple effects.
But it had huge ripple effects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So institutional drift can be a good thing.
It can be good or bad.
It can lead to inclusive institutions.
Right.
But it can also lead to extractive institutions.
It can also lead to extractive institutions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now, what about these institutional traps?
Okay, so institutional traps...
that you mentioned...
are basically situations where extractive institutions get locked in.
Oh, okay.
And they're very hard to change. Because the people who benefit from them...
Yeah.
The elites...
they want to keep them.
They want to keep them in place.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so give me an example of an institutional trap. All right, so a classic example is the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the Ottomans were actually quite advanced militarily.
Okay.
They had cannons.
Okay.
Pretty early on.
So they were ahead of the curve.
They were ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
In terms of military technology.
In some ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they also banned the printing press.
They banned the printing press?
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
They were afraid of the spread of information. They thought it would destabilize their power.
So they're trying to control...
And they wanted to control information.
Information.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So they had these powerful guns.
Yeah, they had the guns.
Bang. But they couldn't aim.
But they didn't know how to use them effectively.
Right.
Yeah, because they were...
Or they were cutting
themselves off.
Yeah, they were cutting themselves off from knowledge.
From knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is something that the authors talk about a lot, is this temptation to prioritize short-term gains over long-term development.
Right. It's like...
So like the Ottoman elite are thinking, it's like the farmer.
Yeah.
Who cuts down the fruit tree.
To get all the fruit.
To get all the fruit at once.
At once.
Yeah, like instead of letting it grow.
Having fruit every year.
And producing fruit for years to come.
Right. Okay.
So short-term thinking.
Short-term thinking versus long-term thinking.
Can lead to these institutional traps.
Institutional traps.
Okay. Now let's talk about China.
Okay.
China has obviously experienced huge economic growth.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this framework?
All right. So China's a really interesting case.
Okay.
Because they've achieved this remarkable economic growth.
Yeah.
Without being a democracy.
Right. They don't have
fully inclusive
political institutions.
Yeah. Right.
But they have implemented some inclusive economic policies.
Okay.
So
give me an example.
Yeah. So like in the late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping introduced these reforms.
Okay.
And one of the key reforms was the household responsibility system.
What was that?
So that basically gave farmers more control over their land.
Okay.
And it allowed them to keep more of their profits.
Okay, so more incentive.
So there was a huge incentive.
To work hard.
To work hard and to produce more.
Yeah.
And this led to a massive increase in agricultural output.
Okay.
And then they also...
That's inclusive on, like...
private enterprise.
The agricultural side.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this also peppered our industry.
A huge boom in entrepreneurship.
Okay.
And so...
And they kind of liberalized...
Yeah, they liberalized the economy.
The economy.
In many ways.
Yeah.
And this has resulted in...
And the result, just incredible economic growth.
Have been incredible.
Yeah.
Like, how much growth are we talking?
So in 1980... China's per capita GDP was something like $194.
$194.
Yeah.
Okay.
Today, it's over $12,700.
Wow. Okay.
So massive.
Massive increase. Yeah.
Okay. But
the authors also caution that economic growth alone doesn't guarantee long-term success.
Okay. So you can
grow really fast.
Have a period of rapid growth.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean...
But that doesn't mean
that you're going to be able to sustain it.
You're going to be able to keep it going.
Yeah.
Right.
And they point to the example of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
So the Soviet Union also had...
impressive growth.
A period of impressive growth. In the early 20th century.
Yeah.
But their system ultimately was not sustainable.
Because it didn't
allow for
innovation. And adaptation.
Yeah.
And change.
It was very rigid.
Yeah.
And it couldn't adapt.
Okay. So what does that tell us about China's future?
Yeah, I mean, it raises the question of whether China can continue
to grow
at this pace. Without becoming more politically inclusive.
Yeah, without reforming their political institutions.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's kind of an open question.
It's an open question.
Yeah. Interesting.
So the big question, of course, is
can
nations change their destinies?
Yeah.
Like if you're a country...
Can you
stuck with extractive institution?
Yeah, can you escape that trap?
Yeah, can you escape?
Yeah.
And the authors say...
yes.
They do.
Yeah.
They're optimistic.
They're optimistic.
Okay.
And they point to examples like South Africa.
Okay.
So South Africa, after the end of apartheid, they were able to transition
to a more inclusive system. Yeah. And they avoided a lot of the violence,
the bloodshed,
and the chaos
that you might have expected.
What you might have expected.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So they're saying,
and the authors have this great quote. They say, "History is not destiny." But rather the result of a multitude of choices at critical junctures.
So it's not predetermined.
It's not predetermined.
They have
agency. Yeah.
You can make choices.
That
will affect your future.
That will shape your future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
So for our listeners out there,
right,
how can they apply this framework?
Yeah. How can you use this?
Of inclusive and extractive institutions.
In your own life.
To the world around them.
Yeah, so I think it's a really useful lens to look at current events.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're following the conflict in Ukraine.
The war in Ukraine.
Yeah. You can think about the institutional factors that might be contributing to that conflict.
Okay.
So, for example, Russia is a country with very extractive institutions.
Okay.
And that might help explain...
their aggression.
Some of their behavior.
Yeah. Okay.
So
help us understand
if you're looking for
the global economy.
Yeah.
And you see that, companies are moving their factories from China to Vietnam.
Yeah.
You can think about what are the institutional factors
that are driving
that shift.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So it gives you this.
So give you a deeper understanding. Of what's really going on.
Yeah. A framework for understanding.
Just a framework for analysis.
These complex events.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this has been
it's been a pleasure.
Illuminating, deep dive.
It's a fascinating topic.
Into why nations fail.
Yeah.
I highly recommend this book to all of our listeners.
I do too.
If you want to...
It's a must read.
Go even deeper.
Yeah.
We actually have a document.
Yes.
With 20 key case study analyses from the book.
Drawn straight from the book.
All you have to do is reply in the comments with Fura.
That's ZHIDUMIMA.
Which is our English-speaking listeners.
Institutional code in Chinese.
Yeah, yeah.
And we will send you that document.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Be sure to tune in.
For our next deep dive.
For our next deep dive.
Where we're going to be looking at guns, germs, and steel.
Guns, Germs, and Steel.
By Jared Diamond.
Which is another
big one.
Really big book.
Yeah.
That tries to explain the course of history.
The same question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're going to be comparing and contrasting those two books.
Yeah. What they agree on, what they disagree on. Yeah.
See, it should be interesting.
Where they differ.
Yeah. Yeah.